bowels, these products are flying off the shelves, and it's a really very much an accelerated growth market. So we've brought together a whole ecosystem of the food supplements industry here, representing regulators, manufacturers, academics and consultants. But one of the big questions that is often being asked is, are these supplements too good to be true? So we see cohorts of influencers and celebrities sharing, sometimes oversharing, how supplements have changed their lives. Well, we're going to try and break that down a little bit. And it brings us to one of the big problems when it comes to these supplements, the grey areas. The grey areas that these supplements inhabit, and how to manage the claims that are often on the labels. Do they really have scientific backing? Well, that's something we're going to be looking into. And could they be doing more harm than good? Well, we're going to look into now what actually makes a health supplement. There is some ambiguity, as they do cover a range of products, for example, vitamins, herbs, probiotics, and what's more, definitions do change across different countries and regions. So a claim that is made, for example, in France isn't the same when it comes to Dubai. So we're going to bring in Fiona Lalor, who is the Director of Executive Education at the University College Dublin, regarding clearer regulatory frameworks and better education. And how that could be an important way to help clear up some of the grey areas where food supplements inhabit these days. So do give Fiona a warm hand of applause.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Good morning, everybody, and thank you indeed to Dubai. I've never been to this part of the world, so I'd like to thank the Dubai municipality for inviting me and to give me the opportunity to see the Middle East a little. So I'm going to be talking to you this morning about claims. We'll discuss whether it's a food supplement or whether it's a food, and the specific rules and regulations around that. Yeah, so before I do, sometimes when you come to these international conferences, you see people standing up on the podium and they talk, and you say to yourself, I don't know really where they come from or who they are or what are they doing there. So I thought I would just put myself in perspective, put a picture of me. So this is me, okay, now you know who I am, very interesting. But where do I come from? I come from the Republic of Ireland. For some of you, you've been there multiple times. For others, you don't. So I thought I'd show you a little. This is a map of the European Union. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a decent one that was I only wanted it to be in 2 different colours, but unfortunately it came in 3. Because all of those blue countries are members of the European Union, and the orange there is the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, which some of you may or may not have heard of recently through the Brexit development, some might say, that the United Kingdom has now left the European Union, which ultimately what that does and what that means for us as an Irish person is that if you see the little blue teddy bear kind of hanging on the end, we are now the only native English-speaking country in the EU, so we're clinging on for dear life and hoping that the rest of the European Union don't forget who we are. So that's where I come from, and I'm on in the next slide I'll show you a little bit more. And specifically, I work at University College Dublin, which is a great little arrow, but I was attempting to point out where in Ireland you would find Dublin. So that's where I come from. I teach at the UCD School of Agriculture and Food Science. So specifically, I talk and teach about food policy, food regulatory affairs, how you take food science and incorporate it into policy on a variety of areas. Typically, I talk about food safety policy, but today, and a particular area of interest to me is nutrition and health claims on foodstuffs. And that's where I came from, and that's why I'm standing here this morning. So we're going to focus just on these nutrition and health claims that you see on foods. So, for a long time in the European Union, there was no uniform definition of a food. It was defined in different ways using different pieces of legislation, which really made the whole discussion quite complicated, not just in terms of claims, but in terms of all regulation in relation to food. So in 2002, the General Food Law Regulation was published, and finally we had a uniform definition of what food was. It's any substance or product. You don't even need me to read that. We all know what food is, but we need it for purposes of legislation. It needs to be published and printed. So that's what a food is. But what's a food supplement in terms of this morning? A food supplement is something. It can be a pill, just a bottle of something. It can be a capsule or a powder or something, some sort of product that you take to supplement your diet. It's not a total food, but it's only meant as a top-up, if you like. However, and there's specific legislation in terms of food supplements that both defines them, but also gives you some rules around what's permitted. So these are the three principles around food labelling and food supplements in the European Union specifically. I'm not going to talk at all about the first one, which is Regulation 1169 of 2011 on general food labelling. That's the legislation that tells you need to say the name of the product, you need to put the best before date, you need to list the ingredients. That's all terribly mundane and not remotely interesting, but it needs to be there nonetheless. Directive 2002, number 46 on food supplements is not one I'm going to talk about specifically either, and there's one main reason for that is because a food supplement is essentially a food. I know at a conference like this, we're all really fascinated by food safety, and everybody loves it, but this is not a talk about food safety. I'm not going to be discussing food safety. We're not interested in terms of health claims on food safety. What we are interested in is the efficacy of the product. So these kinds of discussions are about, does it do what it says on the tin? Not, is it safe to consume? That's somebody else's problem. So we're not going to be talking today about the safety of these products. There are lots and lots of people out there with lots and lots of expertise in terms of maximum permitted levels and how much vitamin can I add and what form does it need to be in, and all of those kinds of conversations are done by other people. Today we're just going to be looking at the claims themselves and does the product do what it sets out to do. As I said, there's Directive 2002 listing legislation and sort of repeating verbatim what legislation says can be terribly dull, and it's not something that gets people particularly excited. But we can't have these conversations without accepting and acknowledging that this exists. So in terms of labelling for food supplements, there are some additional requirements that you have to put on the label. The name of the categories, the portion of the product, a warning not to exceed, and etc., etc. But again, that's not really what's interesting for us today. What's interesting for us is what can you say? And for the purposes of a health and nutrition claim, a food supplement is a food. So they're treated exactly the same way. You would not think that if you headed into your local pharmacy or indeed your local supermarket, because there seems to be a myriad of claims and a plethora of claims presented on packaging on food supplements. Not all of those are permitted, and sometimes there are sort of sneaky and clever ways to put labels on those claims, but certainly in the European Union the rules are really very tight as to what you can say and what you can't say. And that's what EU Regulation 1924/2006 specifically focuses on. So we're going to talk about those nutrition and health claims. What's the difference and what do you need to supply to the powers that be in order to be allowed to make those claims? Why do we need to consider them is an important component of all of this. And there's two principal reasons. One is to ensure that consumers are not misled. It's very important as a consumer purchasing product that we have faith and trust, we can believe that what we're buying is exactly what's in a product. Because not just, so this sort of extends even beyond nutrition and health claims on supplements, but it sort of leads to the discussion around trust and consumer trust in the food industry. And if we can't trust the food industry, we end up in all kinds of trouble. That's why even things like food safety incidents and food safety crisis can lead consumers to question their trust in the industry, which makes life very difficult for everybody. And the second reason for why we need to consider claims is to facilitate cross-border trade within the European Union and also beyond. As I mentioned to you already, where the European Union, if you can see the map there, all our blue countries, our challenge in Ireland is to continue to trade without the UK land bridge, which makes our life a little bit more difficult in terms of checking of products that used to have to go through it. You see, as I said, we're kind of clinging on the end there and hoping that nobody forgets who we are. So the regulation 1924/2006 defines a claim. It splits them into two separate categories. There's a nutrition claim and a health claim.
A claim in general is a message or representation which is not man-through, which is important. You don't have to make one. But if you do, there are very clear guidelines as to how you're supposed to go about doing that. A health claim is one that states, suggests, or implies that there's a relationship that exists between a food category or a food or one of its constituents and a particular, and health in general, or health in terms of a specific condition. So it links a nutrient to a particular health condition. A nutrition claim, on the other hand, is really just a statement of fact. It's just stating that a particular product contains a particular component. A health claim is where it gets a little bit messier. And that regulation was published back in 2000. In fact, it was published in January 2007. And at the time, there was consternation and excitement and a degree of anticipation within the industry as to what it means and what we're going to say. So we'll talk about how the industry went about looking to the Commission, to the European Commission, to say, what do I need to do? How can I put my statement on pack? And it was sort of an exciting time, some might say, in a kind of geeky, sciencey kind of way. But first of all, we're going to look at nutrition claims. And as I said, they're anything that you just statement on pack. They provide the annex to the legislation provides very clear guidelines in terms of how much, in what format, and how it has to be present in your product. So you could claim that something is low fat, or something has high protein, or contains calcium, or indeed omega-3. It's a variety of different omega-3 combinations may or may not be present in your product. A nutrition claim states that the energy a product contains either high or low, or in comparison to the typical product. Also looking at specific nutrients, so it contains a source of iron, this contains a source of vitamin D. There are 30 approved nutrition claims on the European statute books. So if you want to say that your product, for example, is energy-free, then it cannot contain more than 4 calories or 17 kilojoules per 100 mils of product. And these are the kinds of conditions that the legislation provides for a variety of different ingredients, most of which are the macronutrients, so the energy, the carbohydrate levels, protein, and that sort of guideline of fat and saturated fat. So I just gave you samples there of what a nutrition claim can do. They are used uniformly and widely across the industry. The only condition is as I said, there are a number of conditions, but an additional condition is if you're going to state that your product has a particular nutrition claim present, then you must provide the nutrition label. You have to provide the guideline or you have to provide the nutrition information, should I say, which is slightly different in terms of the European Union than it is in terms of the US and other parts of the world. Anyway, we're only really talking about the EU. So those nutrition claims are straightforward. There's nothing fancy about them. It is what it is. The EU has approved 30 of them. If it's stated there and you have it in that condition, then you're good to go. So these are just examples of what nutrition claims might look like. You're all familiar with these, and this is why sometimes this topic of conversation does generate a degree of interest. It can be, first of all, you can produce slides that have lots of colour on them, so there's a little bit more. Once you overcome the dull nature of repeating legislation, to look at, we all go supermarket shopping. Everybody goes to the supermarket once a week, if not more. So we are all very familiar with these kinds of claims that we see. Oftentimes we don't even pay a huge amount of heed to what it is that we see, but a health claim is a totally different bag. As I said, it takes the nutrient itself and combines it or relates it to a specific health condition. A reduction of disease risk is a subcategory of health claim, but again, getting too dull about it. But if you can demonstrate that you've reduced the risk of a particular disease, then you may or may not, you should be in a position to carry that. But that's really where the challenge comes, is what information is required in order to do that. The categories are generic, so generic health claims are those that have been approved by the European Union that link a nutrient to a disease, but that disease or that nutrient rather, that is generally accepted scientific evidence. So everybody would accept there's a link between calcium and bones. Everybody accepts there's a link between vitamin D and bones, and that is a generic health claim. Everybody can use that claim, provided you meet the conditions. You don't need to talk to anybody about supplying scientific evidence. And more and more companies are using Article 13.1 claims and not bothering with what I'm going to talk about now because it's just too difficult. There are about 220 Article 13.1 generic health claims approved by the European Union for everybody to use. You don't need to wait 5 years, you don't need to list your proprietary evidence, none of that. So they are very useful, and certainly sometimes when companies come to me and say, can I make a claim, can I apply to EFSA? I say, now hang on, are we really sure you want to do this? Because it is not for the faint-hearted, and it's a lot more complex, and really there are a lot of generic claims that are already approved, so why would you bother? So the 13.5 are those that are brand new, newly developed scientific evidence. That's for the lab coats, that's for the human intervention studies, that's for those who spend millions on demonstrating that their ingredient does what they say it does. And Article 14 have to follow the same regime as Article 13.5. So they only threw the children in at the last minute in the legislation and suddenly thought, well, maybe they're a high-risk category, maybe we should be giving them extra thought and consideration. So if you can demonstrate that your nutrient reduces the risk of a specific disease or that you influence the growth and development of children, then you can apply for an Article 14 health claim. As I said, there are 229 13.1 health claims, and examples of those are calcium. So the claim that you will find on a pack is that calcium contributes to normal blood clotting, or iron contributes to a reduction of tiredness and fatigue. And they are they're free for us all to use. Anybody can use that, provided you meet the conditions. You don't need to apply for permission or approval to make a claim like that. It's straightforward. And we've all seen them on, some of those might actually be Article 14 claims specifically, but those are like flaxseed oil, blood cholesterol, because there's ALA, there's an omega-3 present. So that's what they look like on pack. Again, you're probably all quite familiar with them. We do become inured to them a little bit and we stop looking at them too carefully. But there are 13.1 claims, anybody can use them. It's the 13.5 ones where you need to supply newly developed evidence to EFSA. I've been through this process myself, and sadly I was not successful. So we put an awful lot of time and an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of resources into applying for a 13.5 claim. The scientific dossier is relentless, and it's trying to identify exactly what it is they're looking for is a real challenge. EFSA does, I'll explain the process of how that works, but EFSA does issue advice to the Commission on how to, in order to make it a little easier for the companies. They do issue advice, but it's still a very complex process. There are not that many of these approved on the marketplace. This was one of the first ones, and it was a water-based tomato concentrate, and it was to generate a benefit in the circulation of the blood. And this is, again, Benecol and Fluoroproactive are two products that will actively reduce your cholesterol. But these have been on the market. They were approved a long time ago. The water-based tomato concentrate is not as visible. That product I don't think is on the market anymore. But reducing cholesterol by barley beta-glucans, for example, is another one that received approval. In terms of the process and the procedure for any of you who might be in the marketplace considering this, you generate a dossier, and initially, in the first instance, you apply to your own member state, and then it goes from the member state, so your own competent authority. In Ireland, for example, that would be the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. You would apply to them, and then they forward the information on to the Commission. They check that we've got all the pieces of paper in a row, and tick, 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 and then they send it on. And then it goes to EFSA, and then there are timelines in terms of EFSA. EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority, and that is where the decision is made. Well, it is and it isn't. EFSA will guide the Commission, so EFSA will conclude with a position on, yes, this is a satisfactory claim, or no, it isn't. And then they will advise the Commission. The Commission is not obligated, the European Commission is not obligated to accept what the EFSA requirement was, but they really would need a lot of explanation if they decided not to accept what EFSA have done. So in terms of the boss, as I've just said, the Commission is ultimately the boss, but they will take decisions based on those opinions that are published by EFSA. And that's where the independent scientific consideration is completed. So this is what the register, this is available for everybody to see. So if you want to have a look at the register to see what claims, particularly if you're in this space, I'd be recommending to begin with, you look at the 13.1 claims to see what you might be able to do without all of the rest of it. And this is available on the European Commission website, so you just look up the register. It's actually very consumer friendly. It's very easy to navigate. So I'd recommend that you do that if you're interested in this space. So what requirements do they look for? these are the three questions that you have to have a positive yes to in order to be in order to get a positive opinion. Is the food sufficiently characterised? Is the claimed effect beneficial for health? And is a cause and effect relationship established between the consumption of the food and the claimed effect? And if you don't get 3 yeses to those 3 questions, then your claim is not going to be approved. And oftentimes you'll see a yes to number 1 and then a yes to number 2, but not to the third one. And it's really very challenging for the food industry. They end up having to do human intervention studies, which is not what the food industry does. That's not where they typically have their expertise. Their expertise is in manufacturing yogurt products. Their expertise is not in conducting human intervention studies. So it's almost pharmaceutical level evidence that's required. And establishing that you have a cause and effect relationship because of the consumption of a particular food product or a particular food ingredient is a very, very difficult thing to do. These are as of June 22. This information is not typically available. You'll see very often that there's a low percentage of those. So of the Article 13.1, only 5% were ever authorised in the first place. They received 44,000 in the first instance, but they managed to reduce that down. Only 6% of the Article 13.5 have been actually authorised by the member states, and likewise 14.1 and 14.2 are the level of authorisation is very low. Why they fail, as I've said to you, is really the cause and effect relationship. That's the most important aspect where a claim application is not going to get itself over the line. And sometimes actually characterising the ingredient is something that again, as I say, the food industry is in the business of making food and making jams and making maybe complex products, maybe the food supplements industry in terms of food processing, but really they're not in the business of characterising their ingredients to the nth degree that is required to get approval. This is just an example of where it doesn't work, if you like. The use of probiotic on a food label. These are defined as live organisms which, administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. And according to the EU law, the term probiotic is not permitted. It's an implied health claim, and it should not be used by the food or food supplements industry. So you should not see the word probiotic on an ingredient. However, there's confusion, even never mind the rest of the world, there's confusion across the European Union. In Czechia, the probiotic is considered a nutrition claim, so they permit it. In Italy, it's outside the scope of the regulation altogether, so they permit it. In Denmark, the Netherlands and France, it's considered a category separate to. So you will see it across the European Union, but that's because countries have kind of gone off piste, if you like, and have decided that there's so much pressure from the probiotic industry, really, that there is a beneficial effect from taking these, and it should be visible, and they should be allowed to make the claims that member states have sort of used creative ways to come up with alternative strategies. So they need to fix that problem. Where we operate in a single market and confusion reigns at the moment, and they need to harmonise that particularly quickly. I see I've got 20, I was given 20 minutes, I thought it was 30, so I will have to skip through. I was asked specifically also to mention the US. I'm not going to mention it because I've run out of time, but only to say that they do it differently in the US. They have 3 particular categories. You need to supply evidence, but what they have in the US is an interesting tool that in Europe we as of yet certainly have not embraced, which I think would be maybe speed up the process a little bit. You can use a health claim based on authoritative statements. So if you get a statement, for example, from the National Institutes of Health that says a probiotic we believe does X, then you're in a position to make that claim. So you're kind of using their support behind you to say, well, we haven't done all the studies, but these guys say it's okay, so that's okay for us. And that I think is a very useful tool, and it might help speed up processes for the industry if we could perhaps hang our hat on that as a strategy. Not so much the qualified health claims, I don't know that they're really going to wash. They also use them in Japan. When scientific evidence falls short of that's required, you can sort of say, well, we haven't really got the full evidence, but we have a little bit of evidence, and we kind of think that maybe if we use this. So I don't think the consumer particularly likes the qualified health claim approach for that reason. They also, in terms of not just only do they regulate it differently, but they also consider it in terms of a category as opposed to a food or a nutrient. So, for example, the second one there is fruits, vegetables, and grain products that contain fibre, particularly soluble fibre, and the risk of coronary heart disease. They accept that. That's a claim that you can make. So they consider the whole category and the whole disease, which is possibly easier for the industry to navigate, and possibly the link between sodium and hypertension, for example, is much easier to declare on pack. Whereas in Europe, we have to demonstrate that for each ingredient. So it's much more complicated and much more difficult, and arguably limits the innovation and creativity that's open to the European food industry. As I mentioned briefly, qualified health claims, I don't see that they're really going to wash. It is an approach that they take both in the US and in Japan. I don't like it. It's not much good to tell me as a consumer that maybe the evidence is there, I'm not really sure, but at the moment we might be able to, that's not, you need to be giving consumers very clear pictures, and I think that just muddies the water a little, so I wouldn't be advocating that. And with that, I think I've made a bit of a mess of my time, but that's all I do. Thank you.